Back in the 17th century, Germany was no stranger to witchcraft trials. In fact, some might say some of the biggest and most gruesome trials did indeed take place there. From the Trier witchcraft trials, the Fulda witchcraft trials, and the infamous Bamberg trials, many people were arrested, tortured, brutalized, and more often than not, beheaded or burned at the stake. The witchcraft trials at Würzburg between the years of 1626 and 1631 were no different, which saw not only mass trials, but mass executions that amounted to nearly 1,000 people paying the ultimate price. Evidently, witches were thought by many Europeans to be a severe danger to society, and the idea that these witches were practicing the dark arts, conspiring against their neighbours and the very people in power was absolutely unacceptable. Witches were on the one hand feared, considering their supernatural abilities, but also many saw it as their duty to their god to rout out what they deemed were heretics and stamp out their sinful ways. In the 1620s, however, the 30 Years' War raged through Europe, a conflict that saw the future Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II, who was the King of Bohemia at the time, seek to impose absolute Roman Catholicism upon his domains. However, Protestant uprising, most notably in German areas, amongst others, saw tense resistance to the emperor. Clashes between Catholics and Protestants were abound, and many were killed in both military and civilian skirmishes. In fact, it is understood that across Europe, somewhere between 4 to 8 million people died, and that most of this was actually due to disease and starvation that came about as a result of the struggle. Certainly an indicator of how bad things were back then. In addition to this, territories were devastated, homes destroyed, societies toppled, political systems overthrown, and not to mention the plagues. Weather conditions were dire, which meant not only grey skies, but also crop failure, which of course led to famine. Now, with the 30 Years' War going on, it's quite easy to see this as a direct correlation of why things were going so terribly. But to the authorities, as well as to the common man, much of these unfortunate happenings were actually a result of witchcraft. More specifically, men and women who were in league with Satan. Witches would almost unanimously become responsible for the hard times that many were experiencing in Europe, and so, it was during these times that waves of witch hunts were unrolled, perhaps more aggressively in the territories ruled by the prince-bishops of the Holy Roman Empire. These prince-bishops, as they were known, were high-ranking members of both the church and within the political structure, as their name indicates. On the one hand, they were clerics, who administered the processions of the Roman Catholic Church. On the other hand, they were the princes of the empire, those that had the same authority as dukes or counts, in that they had influence over taxes, courts, and even the army itself. Needless to say, if they wanted to hunt some witches, they were going to hunt some witches. Prince-bishops who operated in areas such as Würzburg, Cologne, Bamberg, and others would see to it that witches were persecuted with the utmost prejudice, even if it violated the civil rights of those accused. As far as they were concerned, witches, or those who'd made deals with Satan, had no civil rights. Witches were apprehended on the mere hearsay of someone else, and if this could be corroborated by just a minimum of 2 other people, the witch in question would be tortured to confess. Any contrary evidence put forth was often ignored. It would seem that once someone was accused of being a witch, back then in Germany, it was game over for them. Considering how intense the torture was, it would see a spell of spectacular stories produced by the weakened, crippled, and desperate witches who would then name other witches, all in an effort to get the torture to stop. Naturally, the fantastical stories reported by the witches in question and the continued naming of other witches would only intensify the witch hunt frenzy. These sorts of circumstances are exactly what helped shape the Würzburg trials in 1626. where Prince Bishop Julius Ector von Mespelbrunn decided that witchcraft had gotten out of control. With the fall of Protestantism in Bohemia, the Catholic conquest of Germany was resumed in full force, and with it came the insidious vengeance against those who were thought to be practicing witchcraft. Whilst these movements were spearheaded by the Prince Bishop, in some areas in Wurzburg, it was the high-ranking lords, or even the bishop himself, who would instigate the investigations. In other areas, members of the Society of Jesus were those who were ousting witches from their holes, whilst in other areas, local witch hunt committees were organised to scour the streets in search of sorcerers and magic users. In addition to the Prince Bishop von Mespelbrunn, his nephew Philip Adolf von Ehrenberg, a man who would become Prince Bishop of Würzburg shortly after his uncle's reign, would continue the onslaught against the witches. He was to have over 900 people burned over suspected witchcraft in Würzburg and the surrounding areas. None the least was one of his own nephews who had been suspected of sorcery. As far as witch hunting went, blood was most certainly not thicker than water, and it would seem that no one was safe from accusation. In fact, not even members of the Holy Church were safe, for von Ehrenberg would see 19 Catholic priests burned for, yet again, more instances of witchcraft. Not even the youth were safe from von Ehrenberg's wrath against witchcraft, for even children were executed, where in one case, children younger than 10 were executed for supposed intercourse with demons. The nobility were not exempt from accusation, nor torture either. Nobles, councilmen, mayors, government officials, policymakers, basically anyone who wasn't the Prince Bishop himself, was on the list to get it. But to say the Prince Bishop, in this case von Ehrenberg, was the instigator of the brutalities that took place in Würzburg would not be entirely true. Sure, he had a significant hand in pumping the hysteria and contributing to the death toll, but his uncle von Mespelbrunn had been paving the way for such destruction for years beforehand. As early as 1616, the first wave of witchcraft trials fell upon the city, which would initiate the string of sentences that were to follow, and von Mespelbrunn was there green-lighting every single one of them. Whilst the craze hadn't hit boiling point yet, it did during von Ehrenberg's takeover. It's understood that many at the time, including von Ehrenberg, had believed that von Mespelbrunn had done away with the witches during his rule. Therefore, many were not expecting the volume of accounts that came pouring out throughout the city. It is perhaps this public outcry of demons, witches and sorcery that von Ehrenberg believed warranted such a severe response. In part of a letter penned by von Ehrenberg's chancellor, he sets the tone of the time period quite accurately, as he states, "As to the affair of the witches, which your grace thinks brought to an end before this, it has started up afresh, and no words can do justice to it. Ah, the woe and the misery of it! There are still 400 in the city, high and low, of every rank and sex, nay, even clerics, so strongly accused that they may be arrested at any hour. It is true that of the people of my gracious prince here, some out of all offices and faculties must be executed, clerics, electoral councillors, and doctors, city officials, court assessors, several of whom your grace knows. There are law students to be arrested. The Prince Bishop has over 40 students who are soon to be pastors. Among them, 13 or 14 are said to be witches. A few days ago, a dean was arrested. 2 others who were summoned have fled. The notary of our church consistory, a very learned man, was yesterday arrested and put to the torture. In a word, a third part of the city is surely involved. The richest, most attractive, most prominent of the clergy are already executed. A week ago, a maiden of 19 was executed, of whom it is everywhere said that she was the fairest in the whole city, and was held by everybody a girl of singular modesty and purity. She will be followed by 7 or 8 others of the best and most attractive persons, and thus many are put to death for renouncing God and being at witch dances, against whom nobody has ever else spoken a word. As mentioned previously, no one was exempt from the accusations that would have the effect of ending people's lives. The Chancellor here makes a vivid account of just who is being executed, and drives home the point that in this hysteria, no one was safe, and that anyone could have been a witch, even those who were ordained. He also notes that even the popular people of society, those who were attractive and rich, were also being killed for their apparent crimes against God, furthermore establishing the hopeless desperateness of such a time. People of all walks of life, regardless of age, profession, or even gender, were being cornered and condemned. Such were the results of such a great hysteria that took hold of Germany during the early 17th century. Whilst many were known to the city of Würzburg, some victims were of course criminals, or suspected criminals, who could not be proved guilty. Throw in witchcraft, however, and suddenly the courts had all the rights they needed to execute said criminal for another crime altogether. Cases of people singing were also noted as being witches, or that they'd been singing to a tune spun to them by Satan. Others included vagrants, drifters, or pretty much anyone who was just passing through Würzburg who couldn't give a compelling enough reason as to where they were going or who they were. In this instance, a better safe than sorry sort of mindset took precedence, and anyone even remotely shifty was considered to be a worshipper of Satan. The Chancellor went on to say, "To conclude this wretched matter, there are children of 3 and 4 years, to the number of 300, who are said to have had intercourse with the devil. I have seen put to death children of 7, promising students of 10, 12, 14, and 15. Of the nobles, but I cannot and must not write more of this misery. There are persons of yet higher rank whom you know, and would marvel to hear of, nay, would scarcely believe it. Let justice be done." Perhaps more chillingly, he describes the cases of children who were executed for having intercourse with the devil, and that a staggering 300 of them were put to death for this. It is unknown how they came to this conclusion at all, nor what type of person would accuse a child of having done such a thing, let alone know of what intercourse even was at such a young age. He also notes that he witnessed the deaths himself, and one can garner a sense of guilty helplessness from the man, who refers to the whole occasion as misery. He doesn't even allow himself to mention the nobles of society, and appears sickened by this point of his letter, though does infer, perhaps as a God-fearing man himself, that justice was done. He concludes, "P.S. Though there are many wonderful and terrible things happening, it is beyond doubt that at a place called Forenberg, the devil in person, with 8,000 of his followers, held an assembly and celebrated mass before them all, administering to his audience, that is, the witches, turnip rinds and parings in place of the Holy Eucharist. There took place not only foul but most horrible and hideous blasphemies, whereof I shudder to write. It is also true that they all vowed not to be enrolled in the Book of Life, but all agreed to be inscribed by a notary who is well known to me and my colleagues. We hope too that the book in which they are enrolled in will yet be found, and there is no little search being made for it." When von Ehrenberg died in July 1631, the city was taken over by King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, and the witchcraft trials were put to an end. Whilst official executions were halted 2 years prior in 1629, it is understood that witches were indeed still being killed. It just wasn't being recorded anymore. Hysteria would come to die down shortly after, and more people began to question the validity of many of the supposed confessions, as well as the diabolical ways in which the guilty were dealt with. Friedrich Spee, a confessor of witches who operated during the apex of the hysteria, was said to have been so unconvinced by witch confessions that his hair would turn white over the horrors that such people would experience. He deemed confessions by these witches as being worthless, and that not a single one of these confessions had any truth to them, and thus probably were not guilty at all. In the years that followed, persecutions of this size and scale began to dissipate. Whilst witch hunts would sporadically spike in various parts of Europe, Würzburg and its people might have seen enough of the massacres that the city had been the stage of, and perhaps many would secretly share the same sentiments of Friedrich Spee, that those condemned during the witchcraft trials were one of the greatest tragedies to have taken place in their lifetime. As always guys, let me know in the comments below what you thought about today's video, and don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. If you're enjoying the Witchcraft series or any part of the channel, feel free to donate to the cause over on Patreon. As little as $1 goes a long way in helping me keep the channel afloat. Additionally, you can always become a channel member by hitting the blue join button below the video and get access to a few perks. Until next time.